Hello, welcome to today's webinar. So my name's Rebecca Fox, I'm the head of membership at APM, and I suppose my job, I've been asked really to set the scene for the topic of this webinar. And so what we're going to talk to you about is, I suppose, the third part of our golden thread research. So some of you might be thinking, well, what is the golden thread and what does that mean and what's it all about? So in a nutshell, it's a major piece of research that was commissioned by APM, conducted together with PricewaterhouseCoopers, really to understand the sort of size and contribution of project management, programme management to the UK economy, and I suppose in particular measured in terms of its GVA or gross value add, and also to understand, how many people are actually employed in project management. And so the first stage of the research, I suppose, told us that, it is a major contributor, as we suspected, and hence the term why it was called the golden thread. Was it a Cinderella profession that was perhaps, weaving that gold between lots of different sectors? And I think, so really at the high level, big picture level, showed us that, literally £157 billion is generated by the project management profession. And actually we have, just over 2 million people, working in a project-related role, or it actually, that equates to sort of 1 in 12 of the population. And of course, just to say that was obviously pre-COVID-19, and we understand that some of those metrics may have changed slightly as a result. Then, of course, it wasn't just about the big picture. We then wanted to drill down. So we've also looked at the contribution by, I suppose, 4 regions in particular that we looked at. So we looked at the Midlands engine, if you like, the Southwest, where you tend to have a lot of sort of aerospace and defence and high tech. We looked at the Cambridge hub, where you have obviously a lot of life sciences. And then we also looked at the Thames Valley or Heathrow sort of corridor. And interestingly, at that time, I suppose the Heathrow corridor came out slightly on top, that was contributing about 31 billion, closely followed by sort of the Southwest, 24 billion, then by sort of Midlands, and then by Cambridge. And again, now that we're in this pandemic, some of that may have changed. And I think our intention is that we'll certainly benchmark this data in the future. And this is something that we will continue to measure now that we have almost that stake in the ground, if you like. The next level of the research was really to look then at, what is the impact of certain sectors? So how does this break down? So I suppose traditionally we've tended to know a lot about infrastructure, construction sectors, and so we wanted really to look at some of the different sectors that are involved in project management. So I'm really delighted to be joined for this next part by 3 sort of esteemed speakers, and actually people that have been really involved in the research. So going to be joined, I think, first up by Joe Stamford, who's going to talk to us a bit about the deep dive that we took looking into the life sciences sector and healthcare, pharmaceuticals, if you like. Then second of all, we're going to be joined by Tony Mulvale, who's going to talk to us a bit about the SME sector and what the research has shown there. And probably not surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the SME sector contributes a huge proportion of that GVA. And I suppose that's reflected, isn't it, in the UK economy as a whole. And then last but not least, we're also going to hear a bit about the charity sector from Chris Murray. And I think, so hopefully we're going to take you on a bit of a journey, tell you about what the research is showing, what are the next steps. You'll have the chance to ask any questions. And I think I'm going to be joined, if I'm not mistaken, by one of my colleagues, our head of external affairs, David Thompson, who's going to field some of those questions. And then let's take it from there, really. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Joe. Joe, over to you.
So my name's Joe Stanford. I am head of the Corporate Portfolio Office for Health Education England. And this is the clinical education and training arm of the NHS. I'm also head of project profession for HE and lead a cross-sector programme to develop the project profession in the NHS. I'm not really going to talk about the C word too much and the kind of impact that it's had on the world. And maybe we look at it in 12 months' time to see how much the crisis has impacted on the workforce data and the trajectories that I'm going to talk about today. So diving in there to look at the health and social care sector. If we can just move on to the next slide. Yeah. So I won't try explaining the complexities of the health and social care sector, but what I have done is I've included some videos and links to give you an idea of how you can find out more about how the NHS works in England and also how the social care sector works. They are very complex and they have evolved over time, and it's a difficult one to try and articulate. But if you think of the NHS not as a single entity, but more like the Milky Way, it's a collection of hundreds of organisations under a single banner. All organisations are autonomous in the management and recruitment. Staff are recruited by a specific organisation and must apply an open competition to be able to move between organisations. And the other thing is that the NHS is, and that I'm going to talk about, is only about England. The 4 nations are devolved, and that includes the health and social care, and they will operate independently. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So as part of some of the research we did for the development of the Project Profession programme, we looked at workforce numbers and data in England and looked at the number of people working in project management roles. And this is some of the work that informed the Golden Thread case study. There's a mix of roles across the regions. We have very different blend of roles and functions. We have national organisations. And if you can see on the chart, what we've got is a real split across every part of England. And that's good, because what we get is then diversity of roles and opportunity across the landscape. Added to that, we also looked at recruitment data and plotted recruitment to project management roles over the last 6 years. And what that's shown is that the number of recruitments has nearly doubled over that period, that it is very much a growth area within this sector. Moving on, we looked at some of the data in more detail and started to look at things relating to age and ethnicity and diversity, because what we wanted to understand was what kind of mix was there within the profession and how did that relate to the sector as a whole and also to the national average. Because one of the things we're very keen on is improving the diversity of the population within the NHS and also improving the diversity and mix of people working within the profession. So the data here shows that age-wise there is quite a mix of people in the NHS, and I've been doing some professional career coaching sessions with staff within my organisation recently, and one of the things that's really stood out for me is that there is never a point where people have had enough and past it. So I had a session with somebody who was 62, who was bored in their job and wanted a new challenge and wanted advice about how to get that next job and how to get that challenging role. And I think one of the things that we're looking at is, with an ageing population and people having to work till they're 70, 75 plus going forward, how do we make sure we provide really good quality, engaging, challenging careers to people at every stage of their life? We're doing a survey at the moment around apprenticeship programs that looks at different levels of apprenticeships, and we've tested the age range of people that are interested in going on these apprenticeships, and it's actually the majority of them are 35 and over, and we even have people that are in the 55 to 65 age bracket wanting to go on an apprenticeship, which shows a wonderful appetite for learning and a passion to deliver that we really need to embrace going forward, and to make use of those skills and those resources. Looking now at ethnicity, we have a mix of ethnicity in the NHS that's reflected in the profession. It's fairly consistent within the sector. It's also consistent generally in terms of the population, but what we find is that it's a very different regional mix. The other thing with looking at ethnicity, we looked at the different grade bands, and what you see as you go up the grades is that the ethnicity blend goes down. And that's an area we need to improve on, is opportunities for people to progress in their careers. Moving on to gender. When we look at gender, and I think probably everybody knows that the NHS has a very high proportion of women working in it, that 77% of all workforce in the NHS is female. But when you look at the lowest bands of and pay rates, that actually goes up. We've got 82% of people working on the lowest bands are female. When you look at something like specialist and the highest paid, so medical consultants, 63% of them are men. So that shifts completely. And when it comes to CEOs, 55% of CEOs in the NHS are men. So whilst it's a high population of women working in it, they are not working in either the high graded or high paid roles. So there is something we need to do to support women to improve their opportunities to grow and have have the equivalent opportunities as men within this sector. Excuse me. So moving on to project types. Looking at the data that was in the Golden Thread survey for the sector as a whole, there is a real blend of different kinds of project types in the health sector. So the data shows digital transformation, new product development, organisational transformation are the big three, followed by capital projects. And I would say that's fairly representative of the NHS as a whole, where we have big digital transformation projects trying to connect up the whole of the NHS. So you'll have come across this with things like GP appointments online, and areas we've really struggled to get that digital element moving forward. But that's a growing area because, again, digitising connects up information, helps to create flow, and there's a real focus on that certainly from the current government. There's less of a capital investment element. It comes in pockets. It doesn't tend to be the general business of the NHS. What we tend to look at is developing new projects, products, education programs, developing new services, new career pathways, new patient pathways, things like that. But what it does do is it gives us a flavour that as a huge entity, the NHS alone recruits 1.3 million people. There are opportunities for everybody in every type of project. I did a very quick look on NHS jobs this morning to see what the current vacancy looked like, given that we're in a pandemic, and obviously we have a need, and there's also opportunities out there for people to get into or look for job opportunities. And even just looking on that as a snapshot for today, there was sort of 83 roles for project managers and associated roles, 63 around programs, 7 around the PMO, 3 for portfolio, 7 for change, 1 for benefits, and 22 for transformation. Now, I haven't included things like digital and estates because they tend to be, separately promoted and advertised. But I think that when we look at the data and the opportunities and challenges that the NHS is not just facing, but how do we bring it fully into the 21st century with the capability to keep it sustainable for future generations, there is a real demand for the skills and abilities of project professionals in the NHS to to not only bring that skill set to be able to effectively manage change, but also to ensure that we have the right values of compassion and collaboration, a growth mindset, and a culture of learning and evolution. So if I could just move on to how we are proposing to develop that in the NHS. We have a programme of work around the NHS profession. This is a collaborative that's being led by myself and my counterparts in the arm's length bodies and with regional leads to both develop and embed it in the NHS. It's been running for about 3 years. We have a lot of the component parts in place. We have a Project and Change Academy with core skills learning for all. There is a community of practice with about sort of 800 people on it currently. We will do more in terms of embedding the workforce data elements so that we can create dashboards that allows us to keep track of the numbers of people working in the profession, and also how we can encourage and develop the diversity and inclusivity and improve that. We also have sort of updates and newsletters, so connecting everybody together and providing the latest information about what's going on. I mentioned apprenticeships. We have those starting off. And again, this is for me a fundamental thing, which is about the skills and abilities. Linking the apprenticeships to things like the APM qualifications and chartership, so that we've got a professional standing and can talk to our professional colleagues in other areas within the NHS as peers, and show and share our skills and competence. That for me is a fundamental direction that we need to take this in. And the other thing is supporting the learning and development of people, so using things like the development of a competence assessment tool and talent management systems in order to be able to support that workforce in terms of growing, developing, learning and progressing. So that was really a kind of whistle-stop tour of the NHS in England very specifically, but I hope it gives you an interesting insight into what we have been doing and what's happening in the profession at the moment. So that was it from me. If I can say thank you very much, and to go to questions now, please.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. David Thompson here. So first question really is, you know, the NHS, as you've mentioned, is a really complex organisation with, you know, huge amounts of different professions competing and cooperating. To what extent is that a real challenge? That's just things like, how do you compete with clinician-led kind of management? How does that work?
I think it has been a challenge, and there is a sense of clinical-led management and clinical-led change, and how we provide that professional competence to support those developments and to work collaboratively with those clinicians. So clinicians are wonderful about understanding the environment, understanding the content and the direction of travel in terms of where they want to go. What we can add is the skill and ability to help them get there effectively. We've seen in the past where there has been a very specific targets around improvements in the NHS. And what's happened is that those targets have been hit, but because they haven't necessarily had the knowledge and skill around things like benefits and disbenefits and looking at the impact of options, they're often haven't necessarily been aware of some of the ripples that it's caused at other parts of the system. So for me, it's about professionalising, standing up with our peers in clinical and other professions, and being able to add that knowledge and skill and experience about taking people on the journey and understanding the impact and being able to manage that as efficiently as possible, but also to maximise the positive change and also minimise the negative impact.
Thanks very much. I know you don't want to pick up too much on the pandemic at the moment, but one obvious thing that has resulted is increased collaboration, both, you know, across different parts of the NHS, but also with the private sector, etc., in relation to and pharmaceutical companies, in for example, in trying to seek a vaccine. I'm just wondering whether there will be, you observe kind of early kind of lessons learned from having to operate in a different way.
It's an interesting one, because when something like this comes along, all of the normal checks and balances that you put in place to ensure things like value for money, appropriateness, ensure quality, those things tend to get parked for efficiency and speed. And so whilst it's been amazing how quickly the system has been able to respond to the challenge, the quality and the appropriateness and the effectiveness of it will all get learnt afterwards. And we're starting to see some of the ripples of that now, because not everything has worked as well as people might hope it would. I think there is something about the partnership and how those relationships are built. Because again, some of this is about the system has its ongoing operational management role to play, and where we can bring in other areas and specialists in the private sector, pharmaceuticals, universities. It's about developing those relationships to understand how the changes would impact on the system. Because I think sometimes through expediency, things have been developed in isolation that have then therefore not been effective or landed well. So I think lessons learned is that we need to be more prepared and do more emergency preparedness for things like this, but also we need to have those processes laid out. So when something like this will happen, and it will happen again, that we know we have a playbook, and that everybody knows where to go, and everybody knows how it's going to operate. So I think it's more about that rather than some of the sort of the very knee-jerk reactions that perhaps happened this time round.
Thanks very much. And just one final curveball. It's probably an issue that's been postponed, but the whole debate about social care and how that relates to the NHS, is that the next big project for project managers in the healthcare sector?
That's a really interesting challenge, and it is a challenge because, as I said at the start, the NHS isn't one organisation. It's 600 plus individual independent organisations, and whilst it's under the umbrella of some joined up elements, so there are things like the employment system, and there are things around, say, communications that allow us to be able to contact people. There is no consistent way of working, and there isn't consistency around systems, processes, and other things. That becomes even more complex when you look at social care, because at least the NHS is wholly, in terms of how it operates, is within the public sector, and it has a fairly, broad overarching umbrella that allows some of that connectivity to happen. Social care is so devolved down to individual local councils and to independent organisations that becomes a much more complex thing to try and connect up. So I think some of the challenges are initially around getting some of that connectivity around services joined up, is even just absolutely mapping the environment to understand who's participating in this and where are they, and making those connections work, and then start to build relationships, and then start to look at what are the common challenges that we need to deal with that will help to improve the health outcomes and the experience of patients and the public on their journey through those systems.
Okay, here's a provocative question just before we move on. I've got a question about saying that traditionally project management in the NHS has been quite a tactile kind of field chat approach. I don't know whether you agree with that or not, but I'm just wondering whether that, the current environment has changed that at all.
Tactile as in sort of, did you say?
Emotional, emotional field chat, I think is the question, yeah.
That's an interesting reflection. And I think that there is something about understanding that ultimately the NHS as a function is about people, and it's about not just the broken bits of their body that might need fixing. It's about the health, well-being and the emotional wellness of them. And so when we look at programs and projects in the NHS, you know, it's very cliche to say that patients are at the heart of it, but they really should be, because we're not building houses here. You know, this isn't a mechanical process. This is very much an emotional process. And I think if you look at the history of the NHS and people's experiences in the NHS, those things have been treated very separately. That you know, you go into the hospital to have your body fixed. And there wasn't much in terms of support for the emotional and psychological side of it. And that goes for the staff as well, and it goes for the people involved. You know, because this is very much about services, it's about people engagement, whether that's, you know, nurses with patients. A lot of the project management process has to be about taking people on that emotional and psychological journey, as well as putting in place products. So getting it to work in practice is very much focused on the people. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have some really good discipline and really good processes to enable that emotional and psychological change to happen. And some of that's about the training and development we provide to program and project managers and change managers to make sure they have the skills to navigate that human landscape much more effectively. Okay, brilliant. All right, we've probably got to move on there. So thank you very much, Joe. Thanks, David, for curating those questions. So Tony, we're going to come to you next to give us a bit of an insight and lowdown on the SME sector. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for the introduction, Lauren and Rebecca. So yes, I'm going to talk about SMEs in relation to the golden thread, and one of the key elements that came out of the conversation I had with David and with Daniel last year when they presented the golden thread to the SME section was that there was a limited amount of data about SMEs and what they do. There was a lot of good data about corporates, but there was limited information about what are SMEs and what do they do. So for today, I just wanted to go through and give you an idea of what we think of as an SME, what the landscape looks like in the SMEs in the UK. There are some productivity challenges, and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is looking at ways to help address that gap, and talk a little about what SMEs do and some case studies to give you a view of the actual activities within an SME. So first of all, when we think of an SME, we probably think of a small business like this gentleman here who's opening up his shop. He's got a lot of goods behind him in his store, and we think, yeah, this is a small business. But there are some definitions that come out, and the EU says that an SME is a micro business with less than 10 employees and they turn over under 2 million, up to 50 employees for a small business and turnover of 10 million, and for a medium-sized business up to 250 employees. Whereas in the UK, if you're filing your accounts with Companies House, then you're a micro business. If you're fewer than 10 employees, balance sheet number of £316,000 and your turnover is £632,000. So you can see there are some differences between what different parts of different organizations think of as a small business. And when we go into a little bit more detail, we find that actually there are other definitions with departments such as HMRC looking at SME tax credits and research and development relief, and that's up to 500 staff and turnover in the 100 million euros, 86 million euro region. But BEES, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, they look at these criteria with one of 250 or fewer employees, turnover of 50 million and 43 million of balance sheet assets in euros. And of course, you can see there's a gap between the numbers that Companies House have and the numbers that BEES look at. So it can be a bit confusing when people talk about a small business and what do we mean by a small business. And I hope that gives you a bit of an understanding of some of the sort of technical challenges, but it can be quite confusing. So typically, when we talk about these small businesses and the small business owners, we talk about micros being up to 10 employees, small businesses up to 50 employees, and our medium businesses up to 250. Once we go beyond 250, we're into the large business world. So that's the definitions that we tend to work with in terms of talking about small businesses. The SMEs in the UK, so I took some data out of the ONS. This is all pre-COVID, so this was from March 2020. I was doing some research and just looking at a specific sector of companies that are VAT or PAYE based by region. And what we see here is that when you look at the landscape, there are, in this subset of the data, which is 2.3 million businesses out of the 5.6 million in the UK, over 99% of them are small businesses. They meet our small business definition. Up to almost 2 million of them are micro businesses that employ less than 10 people. So you can see that there are a huge number of them, and they dominate the numbers in terms of the scale of small businesses and medium-sized businesses in the UK. And you can also see from the geographical data that there are businesses spread right throughout the country, through the main counties, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And so they are very diverse. They are located in many areas, and there are, as I said, a lot of them, 430,000 inside London, inside the M25, but the numbers are, similar across the board. And so when you look at the total 5.3 million businesses in the UK, as at March this year, we know that small to medium businesses employed 60% of the UK workforce, and they operate in multiple sectors: construction, manufacturing, hospitality. So there's a diverse range of businesses, and there's a diverse range of locations, and there are many, many of them. So looking at the productivity challenge, so Bees, the department, have done a lot of work looking at where are the productivity gaps. They've done research with the ONS, they have looked at other areas of data, and they have considered the gap this is all done pre-COVID. When they looked at the UK compared to other G7s, you can see there's a 13% gap in productivity, and that's been a feature of the country since the financial crisis earlier in the 2000s. And we know that with the impact of COVID and the change to the EU relationship and coming up at the end of the year, there are other impacts on small businesses that will change the way they work and their operational processes. So Bees are very mindful of that. But some of the other findings that Bees came up with were around the SMEs and their view of the outside world in terms of the SMEs. They find it difficult to meet with other like-minded businesses and find help and sources of funding to work with them. One interesting aspect is this lack of trust in the quality of provision. And I was talking to one company last week. A lady was telling me she had someone come in and do some corporate training for them on HR skills, and this person applied some very large corporate style training to say, well, you need to manage your employees up or manage them out. And she was saying it's some of the worst advice she's ever had. And she feels that, the people who come from the corporate sector don't understand what her business is about and what she's trying to achieve. And the other aspect that the SMEs really look at is the cost. What's the cost to me? Because as a small business, having a person out of the office for 2 days on training is a high cost to them because it really affects their business, but also the monetary impact of it as well. And there are programs in place to try and address some of that. So another piece of the finding was, well, where do these SMEs go for advice? So they go to their peers, to professional networks, organizations such as the Federation of Small Businesses. They'll work with local chambers or people they know who they can trust. They have good relationships with accountants and lawyers, so they like to deal with those sorts of people on a kind of face-to-face basis. Now it's Zoom to Zoom, but they like to see and know the person they're dealing with rather than deal with a large organization. And if you think about your banking transactions, if you work online with your bank, you very rarely speak to anybody from the bank. You'll just log in, make my payments, check if the money's in my bank, and that's all I do. Whereas a small business owner, they'll want to go and meet with their accountant, they want to meet with their lawyer. Can I trust this person to look after me? That's what they're looking for. So that trust for smaller companies is a critical part of their view of the world and how they're going to go about getting help to do better. And so change, change is something that happens, as example as Brexit, the EU transition at the end of the year. A lot of small businesses in the UK are looking at their supply chains, and they're thinking about, how do I adjust my supply chain to cater for these changes in tariffs that are unknown at this point in time. We're in the middle of October. I have no clarity about what the tariffs and the trade arrangements would be. So businesses have moved on and made decisions to say, this is what we're going to do under these circumstances. And part of the outcome from BEES was the finding that, unsurprisingly, the small businesses that sit down and think about their planning and their business processes and look at ways of getting external advice to support them in their formation of ideas and plans, and seek out those formal training opportunities from local councils or borough councils or local enterprise partnerships, are more likely to do better. And that, I think, is where the opportunity lies for people with project management experience, is to be able to sit down and work with a small business and understand how that business works, and look at ways of helping that business perform better as a business. And it may not just be about managing a project, it may be about actually helping them with advice and looking at ways of working more efficiently using some of the project management skills you have. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail. So they are constant planners, they own products, and it tends to be product focused rather than project focused. So they will work with a small group of people. The ownership is with the company and the team that they are working with. So if you have a window manufacturer, that's all they're going to do. They make windows, and they make different size windows, but they don't do anything more than that. They're managing a product. And an example of that is Nelson Glass dishwashers. They're close to me. They make dishwashers for hospitality companies, and they only make a half a dozen different types of dishwasher. But it's a very, very niche market, and they have a very demanding client base for their product. So these owners, they sit there, they're at the hub of their organization, and they are pulling the strings like product managers would in a more agile environment. If you're used to agile methods and agile delivery, you talk about product owners rather than, and product managers rather than project managers. And so they have a variety of skills. And, you know, they run operations, they look at the accounts, they bring in people and manage the HR piece, they oftentimes run their own projects. And so those skills become part of their change activity. So logistics, supply chains, technology solutions, digital is a big thing at the moment, trying to get value out of data in your business, and looking at business processes as well. So SMEs cover a broad range of skills in a very small environment. So my example earlier about my fashion manufacturer, they needed to remodel their supply chain because of the EU transition, and they need to have that in place by the end of the year. So they're working against a fixed deadline, and we're all familiar with this if we've worked on big projects about what fixed deadlines are like. And so they've had to think about, well, what does it mean for their operation? Prior to the change, they were shipping finished goods into the UK. It's in the single market, doesn't attract any tariffs. When the EU exits at the end of the transition period, they'll be looking at 12 to 15% tariffs on finished goods in the UK. So they've had to move their quality control processes back to their factories and closer to the source, and they're only going to import a certain amount of their goods into the UK. And they're also looking at ways of building a distribution hub out of a part of Europe. So that is an example of how they've had to understand the challenges. What's my return on investment for this project? Look at my supply chain, look at the alternative approaches, and then implementing those changes to make their supply chain work more effectively. The coffee importer, here we're talking about, you know, specialist coffee. They want to build a new warehouse. They're scaling up from a startup operation where they've got goods in their warehouse that's a self-storage unit. They're using their family to do all of the distribution. Now they want to get in and look at how do they support the forecast demand for this, and they needed to acquire a warehouse and enhance the distribution network. And there are a number of activities in that, and one of the items that came out in conversations with them was actually, we want to build a ground coffee solution. So that meant they didn't just need a warehouse, they needed a part of a warehouse with a unit in there where they could take the coffee and grind it and seal it hermetically. So that was a different challenge. Your digital marketer, lots of interesting challenges here about trying to get data in, clean and manage segregated client data for products in a technical world where you can build GDPR compliant data. So they were looking at ways of getting that data in, getting it clean and keeping it high quality while segregating out the different client sources of data and making sure that their solution was GDPR compliant for their activities. And then we have a professional practice, so accountants and lawyers. I was talking to a lawyer the other day. They have ongoing projects. They have many projects to support their activity, and this managing partner, he works with his office manager to think about their strategic plans 3, 6, 9 months, a year or more in advance, and what are the projects they need to support this. And some of the things that they do are office moves and space restacks as a project. We figure out what the project looks like, we figure out how the move is going to work, and then we deliver on the move. Cloud-based software solutions, so they've been migrating to cloud-based CRM. They've also had to think about their logistics with documentation storage, you know, going from a paper-based solution to a digital solution. And also, you know, COVID health and safety plans. That's a project because they've had to remodel their office. They've had to make sure that only certain people come in and come out at certain times. And they also work with procurement for new equipment. And that's simply, you know, new photocopiers, new PCs, office furniture and things like that. So that's a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour of what small business is about, what they do and what they focus on. And as I said, they're product managers who have good project skills, but I think there's ways that as a project manager, you can help a business be more effective by using your project skills to help them with all of these different projects they manage. And that was me. So thanks very much. It's been great to talk to you. And David, back to you.
Can I pick up on your point about productivity and supply chains? Because it strikes me that that's a real issue. But if you're a project manager working for an SMEs, how do you make best use of getting involved in supply chains and what's the government's plans so that project managers should be thinking about how they can optimise the benefits from getting involved in supply chains?
Thanks, David. So the benefit from getting involved in the supply chains is to look at how you can help put in place those plans for the small business to reshape their supply chain and do that. And it's more than just about the project management, it's about analysing and understanding the costs and the benefits of moving these pieces in the supply chain around. So you need some of those analytical skills as well to map out the project as a cost, benefit, return on investment, and then looking at the pieces in the supply chain and how they would move when you shift them around. Now, the Bs are looking at funding peer network training for smaller businesses through the local enterprise partnerships and the growth hubs, and they've put out to tender a number of projects across the country where people can get involved with their local chamber or with local businesses to be part of some of that training, which is basically saying, here's a challenge, how are you going to deal with that challenge, and what are the steps you would go through. And what you tend to find as a project manager is that you've got those project skills and you're able to ask the small business owner about the steps they need to take to solve the project problem without telling them how to do the project. And I think that's one of the key things that you need to consider is ask questions to build the project rather than tell them how they're going to solve it.
Great. I like your phrase "constant planners" as a description of SMEs. I was just wondering whether, I mean, the survey itself, the research we did show up that the number one skill desired for project management within SMEs is planning and monitoring. Does that accord with your experience?
Absolutely, yes. When I look at planning and forward thinking, the coffee example I was talking about, the coffee importer, in the conversations with the business owner, he's saying, well, I want to scale up my supply chain. So the question there is, well, when do you want to do that? Is it 6 months? Is it 12 months? And what would that look like? Are you trying to double your capacity? Are you trying to triple your capacity? So he's looking 6 months into the future to say, I'm going to start my project in 6 months with a view to delivering it in 18 months. So they do have that longer time horizon that they're looking at to run these projects over.
And also, the report picked up 3 essential skills identified for SMEs in project management: risk management, change management and time management. Does that make sense to you? Is that about right?
Yeah, that is absolutely right, David. Risk management, change management, and time management are topics that are in the Bees playbook for this peer network training, where the companies who've bid for these tenders to supply the training have been given a list of topics that might be suitable for smaller enterprises, and they are the first three on the list almost. And I think it's different aspects of it. As project managers, you're used to using SWOT and PESTLE to understand project risk, but you're then expanding that out to kind of cover the company as well. So here's the company, here's the risk profile, here are the things that are on our risk register, and doing that due diligence to map and manage and maintain those registers, and teach the business owner how to do that as well. And change management is another one as well, where some businesses just think, oh yeah, we'll just move this piece around here, but they don't think about the knock-on effects of that. But you also see that in larger companies as well, where Roche last week managed to implement a new online warehouse to supply the NHS, and suddenly the warehouse didn't work because they didn't have the right change plan in place to support the transition. So it cuts right across the board. You want to change something, you need to have a plan.
And finally, this is just sort of really a practical question. When we were looking at trying to develop things like toolkits and other sort of basic support mechanisms as APM to help SMEs in terms of project management, and the real problems was actually trying to get access and that material to SMEs, because it's such a diverse and hard to reach set of sectors. It's really a set of sectors rather than any one sector. Have you any sort of advice, etc.? Because obviously the whole kind of ecology of SMEs is get on and do it, and kind of not really looking up, seeing where can we get advice, especially if they're suspicious of government, etc. So
yes.
Just, I think your experience, practical experience of how to help people who won't necessarily know that they're that help is available, and they don't have the time to access it.
Yeah, they are very good points. The whole concept of finding funding, finding the small businesses. You would think that with Bees offering free advice training sessions, 2 hours every fortnight to work with you and help you solving problems for free, that small businesses would be, lining up to just take that offer and run with it. You tend to find that even with the local chamber and local business organisations pushing out the message on social media and really working hard with their own contacts, etc., take-up of these things can be very limited. And I think that's an area for more research, is to understand, why is it that small businesses really resist this whole offer from companies to say, look, we have the money, we have the help, how can we help you? And I think that does come down to the trust factor and knowing them and spending time with them. And for me, for some small businesses, I've been talking to them for 12 months. And finally, after sort of 12 months of talking with this business, someone said, yeah, actually, Tony, I'd like you to help me with this particular problem. It's not like I go to a procurement website and I find out what the bid is and I write up a nice tender document with all of the benefits that my project will deliver and how I'm going to manage it and the outcomes you would expect. I have to go and work with them and understand them and generate that trust, and it takes time. And I think that's the key difference at that sort of small to medium level.
So I think, Rebecca, we're going to move on to the third section now. We
are indeed. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, thanks, David. That's very nicely on time. So yes, so this just brings us now to the last segment. So we're going to have Chris Murray up next, just to talk to us, give us a bit of a case study, I suppose, from the charities sector. And so Chris is going to present for sort of 20 minutes. Then again, we'll have sort of 5-10 minutes of Q&A. And then I think David and Daniel, you're going to give us a sort of debrief on what we've heard, haven't you, just at the end. So Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. And what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is just give a bit of an overview of the charity sector, certainly from the children and young people's perspective. I'm the CEO of a small but well-formed charity in northwest London. We service approximately 207 member organisations that work with children from the age of 5 up to the age of 25 if young people have a learning difficulty or disability. And one of the key aspects of our work is actually the planning of the outcome. So primarily we are looking at how we can support children and young people to not only have a successful transition from childhood to adolescence and into adulthood, but actually all the key component parts that make up the whole person. If you'd like to go to the next slide, please. So, like I said, we're a small charitable infrastructure organisation, and we were set up in 2015, 2016 by a organisation called John Lyons Charity in Northwest London. And John Lyons Charity, if you know Northwest London, was set up to manage the traffic from London to Hertfordshire along the Hertford Road, which is now the Harrow Road, and the Edgware Road, if you know those two intersections of London. And what basically it's meant is that there's now a certain amount of funding that goes into the Northwest London corridor, which is around 12 million across the 8 boroughs, including ourselves. And my job is to kind of support the voluntary sector to access funding to do the activities that they need to be able to support children and young people to have a decent adolescence and childhood. And that does pose a range of queries and opportunities at the same time. And one of the things that we've been looking at in Brent is how do we implement a theory of change to demonstrate the traffic of young people coming in and out of activities, how young people are doing at school, and how young people are navigating some of the more challenging spaces in and around their local communities. And project management lends itself perfectly to that space. So Young Brent Foundation, or YBF as it's known more locally, is exactly that. We support our members as widely as possible. We look at fundraising opportunities. We coordinate bids, just like Tony just mentioned, around in terms of tender. And we actually do look for the measurement in desired impact on children. How much of what we're doing is making any difference? If we weren't in this space, what difference would it make? If you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. So we look at 3 intersections, 3 opportunities where growth and development can take place. And from a project management perspective, you cannot work in these areas if you do not have a plan. And primarily, I think Joe stole a little bit of my thunder earlier about building houses. That's absolutely not what we're doing, but we are looking at how we can support children and young people to have a thorough chance at life. And so we look at it from a 3E perspective: education, environment, employment. And from an environmental perspective, I'll start there. We look at how the physical environment, the spaces where young people occupy with or without their families, has an impact on the way they see the world or interact with the world. The social environment, who they interact with and why they interact with those individuals. The cultural aspect in terms of their understanding how the world works. So as an example, there's 149 languages spoken in Brent, with a variety of understanding of how the world works, whether it's from a Western perspective, a faith-based perspective, a gender-based perspective. We have to find a way to navigate all those various intersections to support children to have a thorough understanding of the way the world works. And the 4th one is a political environment. So how do we encourage young people to be more socially active and take responsibility for how they see the world, with support from professionals, teachers, champions in their communities, school teachers, so on and so forth. And it's going to take a management style that lends itself to learning. The top one is around education, and that's about the formal spaces, the informal spaces like youth work, play work, and non-formal, the training that young people benefit from, whether that's football coaching, in the arts, playing music, learning a skill that you wouldn't ordinarily get an opportunity in school to do. If I take you back just ever so slightly, in 2010, there was a reduction in services for children and young people nationally following austerity. And as Joe has mentioned previously, and as Tony has just mentioned for SMEs, COVID will have an impact over the next 5 years or so, and we need to strengthen the communities to be able to support the children and young people through this extremely difficult time. We're now looking at exams being taken much earlier in the year, potentially at this weekend in London. We're going up to the second tier in that model of central government. But there's going to be changes, and it's pretty systemic in its design. And for children, young people and their families, that's not really what they're seeing. It's on a day-to-day basis, how they feel and how they interact with the world. And project management approaches really does help us to shape and hold that conversation in an appropriate way. And finally, we look at employment. And how do we support children and young people to think about their futures, have that dream of becoming the next astronaut, the next doctor, the next lawyer, a fantastic footballer, a musician? How do we support young people to navigate those spaces? And it's in our best interest to think long term, think about the investment in young people rather than short term, year, maybe even less in terms of interaction or intervention. Next slide. So the golden thread, and this was coined way before I was involved in APM, so before I get done for copyright. Young Brent Foundation has 3 golden threads through its work, through the 3 E's. In each section looks at, in depth, these 3 areas: intercultural dialogue, intersectionality, and complex trauma. We believe if we can make a slight inroad, a dent, move the dial ever so slightly in any one of these areas, we will see a shift in how young people see and feel about the way they see the world. And again, it is all about the human mind. It is about the complexity of the issues that may or may not be facing a child and or their family. We know during the pandemic, certainly in the early stages, there was quite a notion around BME communities being substantially impacted by COVID-19. And, it could be argued that, I think you could also argue that, people with the least amount of opportunities to stay home during the early stages were also impacted. People working in the labour market, people who are opening and shutting shops or driving the local cabs tend to be from local BME or low-income families. So it does stand to reason. It's not based on ethnicity alone, but it's certainly an economic driver. And as we can see now across the country, in the northeast and in the northwest, it's having an impact. So there's something else in play, and it's worth considering. So we do look at intercultural dialogue. We do look at intersectionality, the power of women in the marketplace, and how we as a sector can empower the conversation around how we see and view women in positions of power. So it's our job to open up that debate with young people to start to see each other as human beings rather than a series of labels and stereotypes. And that's really important to us. And then the third section on this, in terms of the golden thread at Young Brent, is around complex trauma. So many young people have a variety of lived experiences, whether they're new arrivals to the UK and have experienced war-torn environments and their places of origin, economic migrants, whether they're involved in issues around domestic violence. Young people have experienced so much at a young age that at some point they're going to need support. And that support is wrapped up in mental health. And again, back to COVID, that is really going to be the tipping point over the next 3 to 6 months, we would argue. Next slide. So introduction to project management for me really started in around 2010 when the original austerity period in the UK kicked off. From 2008 to 2010, there was a period of, I suppose, denial that actually this was really happening. The UK economic market could sustain all the pressures that was coming through from the United States and via Iceland into the mortgage market. Unfortunately, it didn't, and it had a massive impact. Approximately £1 million was taken out of the sector in terms of youth and community work, which meant over 4,500 individuals, over 750 youth clubs lost jobs or centres were closed, which resulted in a massive downturn in provision. And it was at that point, I believe, that project management stood up and made sure that those that set up smaller organisations to become independent youth organisations had the right skills. Next slide. To embrace that period during 2010, and again it's been mirrored in 2020, is the utilisation of Prince2 tools and methodology dovetail with the McKinsey 7S model, if you're aware of it. And what it really does, it gives us the basis to have a conversation about how organisations are going to support children and young people. Are they aware of the risks that they may or may not be encountering going forward? Have they set up their businesses appropriately on the lines of human interaction and the theory of change, or based on a product? Are they trying to sell something, or are they trying to create something? And create in terms of the mind to have a conversation, or are they providing just an activity? Very key questions in our field of work, and in most charities it will be pretty similar. How do you build capacity in the sector? How do you build opportunities for funding? If we're chasing the pound sign at the end of that rainbow and forgotten the reason why we came through the door in the first place, you're likely to lose your driver. Next slide. So some of the key benefits during that period, and again, it does mirror to where we are now, is strong execution of programs. So how do we evaluate what we're trying to do? Whether they're programs over a longer period or projects which are very short term, 3 months, 4 months in duration, they need to have an end to end. And in project and speed, you're going from scope through design to the delivery and then evaluation. There's no difference. Just need to think it through. Create future funding opportunities. So being able to tell the story about the piece of work that you're trying to generate for children and young people is fundamental in being able to draw down additional funding long term. If you don't have the right service, if you don't have the right product, then you're less likely to be understanding how the people you are interacting with will benefit. And that could create its own bottleneck. As mentioned before, time and money are issues in all sectors. At the beginning of this period in March, the world was ticking along pretty nicely for some, not for others maybe. But time and money was always going to be an issue. And it's always going to be an impact query, how you mitigate against those particular risks. Reduction of duplication of effort, good research, good capacity building opportunities. Be prepared to learn from others, so explore opportunities to attract funding. Again, telling the story. And finally, it's always about evidence-based outcomes. The reason why you're doing what you're doing. And as today, we're using technology that we wouldn't have used 6 months ago. So we're all in a different space and we're all learning as we go along, using technologies that are either of benefit or will increase productivity. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges, lack of training, where we're using volunteers or paid staff. Inappropriate training will result in poor outcomes. So we do need to invest in adequate, appropriate, skilled, professionally delivered training. Without that, we will just be circling the wheel back to a system that failed some young people and will continue to fail going forward. There are some aspects of COVID-19 which will give us an opportunity to stop and pause and reflect on the ways in which we worked previously and take into this new world of ours some of those techniques we didn't use that we thought could have worked if we had time. Well, if nothing else, COVID-19 has given us time to think and to reflect, and that's really important. The second challenge is around political and economic uncertainty. We're all going through this, and we all do not know what's around the corner. We can sustain and build and plot as much as we like, but we just do not know. So we do need to have options. Option papers, option papers, option papers, as I keep telling my staff. Think about plan A, B, and C. Don't become over-reliant on local or central government funding. It may not be there in the future. We are all in this together. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, it's about forecasting and budget management, considering what you need, how long you need it for, and what's the value likely to be. That's the reality of the charity sector. You just never know what's around the corner. Strategic planning, extremely important to fundamentally think about who we're trying to serve and why. Consider the development of theory of change. Do you have a plan? What is the plan likely or trying to achieve? And over what scale? Have you designed the outcomes rather than the outputs? Have you considered the ways in which you're going to support the sector as opposed to just working in the sector? And finally, impact measurement tools. Have you got the right tools to measure the outcomes that you're looking for? We work with a variety of organisations, from the local authority Goldsmiths College in London, London Metropolitan University. You know, we work with some really good academic spaces to measure the impact of the work that we're trying to deliver. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly go through where we are now. And I know Joe was trying to avoid the C word, so to speak, but I'm not quite sure we all can. So I'd rather just take the hit and just go for it. And what we're looking at now is the recovery stage of exploring what we call the difference between culture and climate. Are we going to sustain the models of behaviours prior to COVID-19, or are we going to shift the climate to a more positive environment? Are we going to reframe our dialogue? We've had two really big incidents this year during March, April and May, one being COVID, the second being George Floyd. And without a doubt, we've all had an experience because we're all at home witnessing what we all witnessed, realising what we all realised, and then deciding what we're going to do about it. And I get a sense that nobody's sitting on the fence now. Everybody is trying to navigate what it means in the real spaces. And for children and young people, it cannot become a more stringent time, being locked at home with spaces that they didn't occupy prior to now having to have a conversation about race and racism. And all this dovetails, as I mentioned before, with how young people may or may not perceive themselves, and organisations need to factor that in. Next slide, please. So in young Brent, we're looking at two options. One is a university campus, which really is, as it says, it's going to be a virtual campus to support learning. And that's a piece of work that's been in play for about 6 months now. And the second one is what's called, in local social care contexts, contextual safeguarding. And that's where we're supporting children and young people in the community. And places like Liverpool right now, we're taking a keen eye on how they can support children and young people to remain in safe spaces. Next slide, please. So the thing is, what to do now? Well, challenge the normal. What does that normal look like? What is it that we need to change? Ask questions to broaden the horizons of children and young people and the organisations that support them. Have an appreciative inquiry. Think about human interaction. Think about the relationships that you're trying to build. And co-create, co-design using innovative platforms that actually children and young people are far more astute at using than certainly I am. Whether they're Salesforce, Planner, Princeton, call it what you will, have mechanisms for change. Next slide, please. So contextual safeguarding as a model goes through a variety of stages, and fundamentally it's about keeping young people safe in their learnt environment, and that's really crucial. Next slide, please. And then we have the universal university model, where various campuses, as you can see, can occupy the minds of children and young people, whether that's in the music world, coordination hub in terms of youth participation, STEM in terms of science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine. And it's really important that we frame it around the young person's learning, and this takes time to learn as a model driving through. Next slide, please. And the key stage is really power of inquiry. Think about future outcomes. Have perspective on taking things forward. Think ahead. Frame and reframe and tell the right story. And enhance personal awareness. Think about the space that young people occupy. Think about how the charity sector needs to support young people who are going to be made homeless this year, unemployed, maybe a breakdown in the family environment. Next slide, please. And as I've said before, and I'm not taking this as my own particular stance, but actually I heard Joe with it slightly earlier. We're not here to build houses, never have been, but we are here to help build minds and secure the future for children and young people. There are over 97,000. There are over 97,000 children's charities in the UK, and 37,000 of those are being directly impacted by the decline in youth services. So stop there. I just want to leave that with you. A third of providers will no longer be here. So they're making more and more children vulnerable in the future. Okay, back to you, David.
You left with the quote, I think, which is a part of a longer quote in the report itself in the case study, and I'd urge everybody to have a look at your case study and indeed the other two we have that are in the report. But I wanted to pick up on that building minds bit, because a lot of people think for charities it's just the demonstration of outcomes and impacts is really too difficult to do. But I like your optimism that actually benefits is so important, and that storytelling is really important. I was wondering if you could pick up on those 2 points, particularly in the charitable sector, because often that it's difficult to measure outcomes, particularly if they're over a longer period of time or they're about about people. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you kind of demonstrate to the kind of to sponsors and to donors how you're making impact and telling that story?
Yeah, no problem. So thank you for that. The first part of that, in terms of the storytelling, is so crucial to organisations, certainly the charity sector. The reason for being a charity in the first place was usually through passion. There was something that happened that was driving the need to be in that space, whether that's a death of a child, a domestic violence situation, a road death. Somebody sets up a charity for a purpose and for good. So we've got to hold on to that. And COVID-19 has presented us with an opportunity to think differently. And so we should grab that opportunity and not fall back into a negative stereotype of how we see the world. So what charities can certainly do is to tell the story of the work that they do, and tell it in a very plain but coherent, measurable way. And funders will hear it, because that's what funders want to support. So it's really important to just stick to your story. Don't worry about how many young people you're seeing in terms of outputs. What they're really interested in is what difference are you making. If you can demonstrate that, a theory of change is a good one, then I think you'll be fine. In terms of what the impact it can make over a slightly longer period, have really good evaluation processes. We put aside a percentage of every bid to tell the story through research, and we will commission, whether it's a local authority to deliver that or one of the local universities to deliver. It's worth it. It's absolutely worth it to tell the right story. We are so busy doing that sometimes we forget we need to tell the right story. Otherwise, you will not get any more future funding. David?
Yeah, one of the things that's coming through the whole kind of COVID debate across all forms of project management is resilience, and that's personal resilience and team resilience. I'm just wondering, you're right at the sharp end of that. How you build that kind of when the walls seem to be closing in, keeping going that positivity you've just demonstrated. Because I think a lot of other people in different sectors can learn lots of lessons about just embedding resilience and keeping going.
Yeah, thank you for that. Resilience is maybe an overstated word, but it's the reality, as I put it. We have to be real about the situation that we find ourselves, and the optimism comes through the fact that we think from an appreciative inquiry. We're not looking for solution. We're just asking questions, and by asking more questions, you'll find your own solutions. And so we don't start at that end. We start at the query. What's driven us to this space and why are we here? And the resilience is knowing you're doing the right thing, even when it seems at its most darkest, you're doing the right thing, and stick to the principles. The principles will keep you in good stead. If you're building a house, you have particular chunks along the way, whether it's the foundations all the way through to putting the roof on and opening the key at the end of it. It's the same with minds. You've got to take your time to think it through, and resilience comes through the planning. That's where you can be as reflective as you need to be to move to the next step. Don't chase that golden carrot at the end of it, that rainbow full of cash. It's not really what it's about. It's really about just taking your time and building resilience in the system through changing the climate rather than changing the culture.
I just wondered about the charitable sector itself. So there are some, pretty well developed and well financed charities that actually have, really well developed project management skills. Think of international development charities and, organisations like National Trust. Do you think there's a case for, at least within the charitable sector, of getting them to do some mentoring to try and effectively try and do supply chain experience? Because this goes back to Tony's point about productivity. I don't mean it in a broader sense, about about lessons learned and about using where charities have got similar challenges but more resources, and how you kind of in a sense scale up across the sector. Whether you've got any observations about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been working on over the last year, and I think COVID's brought it to the fore for us in Brent, and certainly the charity sector in London, is coming together across sectors. And whether you are in the big business of building properties, so we've got big business around the Wembley area, if you know Wembley. Every London borough has a lot of development going on at the moment, and they're perfect sites for project management. It's what they do every day. And how we get them alongside the charities is to say, well, actually, in this community, when this building is finished, how do we continue with that work? How do we develop those skills? So yes, mentoring is crucial, but even more so is the buddying up and recognizing each other's strengths. I think that the confidence that comes from working across sectors is going to be crucial in the coming years. It's never been more important than it has been now. We work cross-sector in Brent. We work across the country in different fields, and we're now working internationally with our partners across Europe. And it's really important that you look and seek support in different spaces. They may not always appear to be the same people. We're working with architects at the moment on a variety of spaces for children and young people, and actually it's working out really, really, really well. So yeah, buddying up is important. Mentoring is vital, but the relationship is the most important thing.
And one final question, many charities have to work on very scant resource, but actually that creates a sort of innovative and a kind of a different kind of mentality. I was wondering whether in a sense there are lessons for others who've got more resources, but actually the challenge of having to do things on a shoestring and actually being quite inventive and innovative in how you do it. Is there any reflections from your own personal perspective of actually using that as a positive?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as we are today, the technology of technology has really shifted the dial in the last 6 months. Never more so than certain platforms benefiting more than others. And the charity sector is moving along that space as well. One of the problems that we've faced is actually having the skill to access those new platforms moving forward. The charity sector has always been agile. It will always find a way to navigate those particular spaces. But the digital technology is going to be crucial. And the digital inequalities, as we found already, is already separating those that have access to those that do not. So really important to think about what spaces can we occupy with the digital platforms, the way we're going to need to in the future, and have smaller spaces from which to do it. I mean, most of us are working from home, 2 or 3 days a week, and I'd argue going back to the office is probably a thing of the past. We've got to think about how we work differently, maybe a day a week in the office as opposed to 5 days. So things will change over the next sort of 3 to 6 months, and will probably become that new normal.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm going to pass back to Rebecca just for a sum up, but I find it just really interesting how many across these 3 different presentations have very similar and common themes like resilience, collaboration, and sort of that's just really absolutely fascinating. So back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so I think that brings us to the end now, doesn't it? And I guess it's just to say that if people would like to have more information, we do have some dedicated web pages which have got the whole, I suppose you can access all of the reports from the sort of bigger picture piece to the different regions and also to the sectors. And then just Daniel, I suppose, did you want to say anything about the sort of future plans, how we're going to use this going forward, and what, how the sort of golden thread will stay alive, and what the next stages would be in the research?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everyone for kind of joining us today, and for the speakers for their time. I think what the golden thread is shown really is actually built on another piece of research from APM called Conditions of Project Success, which looks at in any project environment what creates a successful project. And what the golden threads start to sort to identify is how big is project management, how important is it? And we're actually carrying out a new study building on this original conditions project success called Dynamic Conditions Project Success, which actually touches upon some of the themes that people have talked about today. So the adaptability, the kind of agile nature. So there'll be great opportunities over the coming months for yourselves as individuals and organisations to get involved in that research. The golden thread itself, what we look to do is to do a benchmark. So we found that project management is worth 156 billion and 2 million individuals employed, and that was back in 2018, 2019. What we'd look to do is rerun this study 4 years on to basically see, has project management moved on? Has these numbers increased? Has it spread throughout increasing range of sectors? And the other thing we'd like to actually explore over the coming years is actually one of the common themes I think we've heard today and throughout a lot of this work is the professionalisation of project management, and to see as we've started to professionalise project management, does that lead to improved project outcomes? So again, this kind of builds into the condition for success work, the golden thread, and maybe another piece of research as well. So these are all things to look forward to in the coming months and years ahead. But if you've got any questions, please just drop us a line. As Rebecca said, there's full details of the resources that are available on the website.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So yeah, I don't know, Joe, if you would like to sort of give any closing remarks or comments.
Yeah, I think that these are unprecedentedly challenging times, certainly in our lifetimes, you know, and I think that there is an awful lot we need to do to really support each other and our communities and the people we collaborate with. But I think Chris made some really, really good points about how we need to connect together to work on some of these issues, because there are generational challenges that we need to consider. So it's not just us working with our own individual sectors and areas, but how can we support each other, and how can we, you know, certainly provide an opportunity for young people to have a positive view about the future and get into you know, places where they can then start to build a career and a meaningful and challenging and rewarding life. And how do we make sure that we make that accessible to all, and that it's not just the privileged few? So I think that's something that we can come together to perhaps talk about in future, about how we make those connections and really embrace some of those issues and opportunities to support the future generations.
Thanks, Joe. Tony, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, thanks very much, Rebecca. I have really enjoyed listening to both Joe and Chris talk about the different aspects of it. And one theme I thought that cut across both of them is it's about the people. And that's the same with our SMEs. You know, it's about the people and their businesses, and it's about their learning, it's about opportunities to live a fulfilled life. And each of Joe and Chris have talked about it coming from different aspects, but that to me I think is one of the great things that we need to think about and build for into the future. And the other thing that I think of is, particularly in Northwest London, where Chris is and I'm in Acton, which is part of the West London Alliance, is looking at ways that the corporate sector can come together to help build the charitable sector more effectively. And I think we've got a strong sector like that in East London, but I think in West London there's a much more disparate base of corporate volunteering, and I think there's a great opportunity here for us to apply some project management skills to look at ways of solving that problem. That's all. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Tony. Chris, finally to you. I know we've just heard from you, but is there anything that you would like to add? Sort of closing remarks or comments?
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, can, yes.
Yeah, it was just something that David said. It struck a chord with me about resilience. And I think we mustn't lose sight that this is an extremely difficult period in our history, certainly for COVID, and how we're going to all as families come through this. But also from a social justice perspective, and you know, I'm not going to labour the point about George Floyd, but it has highlighted societal inequalities. And so this is an opportunity, I think, certainly for us as a sector, working with some of the most challenging communities, is that now's the time to have the conversation about the conversation, and project management might be able to help us. So I would love to have a conversation with you all again, I think, and certainly with Tony, about how we can start to dovetail some of the learning in the project management world, as well as in the charity sector. There's an opportunity here, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a huge opportunity, isn't there, for that kind of cross-sector fertilisation, that cross-sector learning, and I think it's been really interesting to listen to the three of you actually. And as you say, there's some real common threads, isn't there, around sort of resilience, around people, and actually, okay, the environments that we're perhaps each operating in can be slightly different, but fundamentally, you know, we're facing many of the same challenges, and many of the, I suppose, sort of learnings are common. Okay, I think I'm going to bring it to a close. We've got 4 minutes, so just finally, David and Daniel or Lauren, I don't know if there's any of you three would like to just add anything. If not, I think we'll bring it to a close. And I'd just like to say, you know, big thank you to our three panelists, a big thank you to everybody that's tuned in to listen. We will make the recording available. And then if any of you do have any follow-up questions that you perhaps didn't get to ask, or there's something else you'd like to ask, send it through to us, and you know, we can always direct it to the person or come back to you. That's not a problem at all. And then do go and have a look on the website on the Golden Thread if you want to find out more about the research as a whole.